Welcome to Off Panel. Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's podcast is with a staff writer at Vulture and New York Magazine who covers comics, movies, and more. It's Abraham Riesman. Thanks for coming on, Abraham.
Oh boy, I'm very excited. I'm a big fan of your writing and of the pod. This is a rare opportunity.
Well, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. You've done a ton of amazing features, and you've interviewed some incredible people, but I want to start with maybe the most important question I can ask you, and that is, you got a tattoo in April, didn't you?
I did. Wow, you really did your research. Yes.
Do you really have idea number 101, solve everything from Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run tattooed on your arm?
Yes, I'm looking at it right now. Yeah, I wrote it down like it looks like a note to myself. It's from the miniseries that launched his run, Dark Reign, Fantastic Four. Of course, it ends up being maybe not the best piece of advice, given what ends up happening with Reed Richards. But I remember reading that for the first time, and even just talking about it right now, I get chills, or my hair stands up. I just thought it was such a fascinating way to approach the world. God, I sound so lame and kitschy when I talk about it, but it's an encouragement to dream big and to go, okay, I have a pile of work that I have to do. What if I just did all of it? And for some reason, having that thought inspires me to get to work. I can't exactly explain why. It should overwhelm me, but it just gets me going.
I have to admit, like the Hickman run on Fantastic Four with people like, Steve Epting, Dale Eaglesham, like Nick Dragotta, everybody like that.
Nick Dragotta, yes, yeah.
That run it's my favorite Fantastic Four run ever, and it made me love them so much more. But on top of that, it is like surprisingly deep at times. There was like that Thing one shot.
Surprisingly, I'm not surprised at all. Hickman's Hickman. He thinks pretty hard about these things. But I'm sorry, you were about to say there's that Thing issue?
Well, no, I was just saying, like, you're right. I shouldn't have said surprisingly. I guess maybe for the perception of superhero comics is a lot of times people don't believe that they can accomplish the depth that they do. But there was the Thing issue where it's like him kind of aging but staying alive forever, and like just kind of how everything changes around him. But my favorite one, I actually wrote about this for like this Italian comic site, because it's one of my favorite issues ever. Do you remember the final issue of FF with Dragotta and Hickman, where they told the story of old Franklin teaching young Franklin how to go into the universe? Oh my God, that issue just blows me. I'm getting chills talking about it now.
I know. One of my favorites from that run is the standalone with the Nazi Fantastic Four, just set in that we find out that the bearded Reed from the Council of Reeds was a total Nazi. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I'm always a sucker for dystopian alternate universes, which luckily superhero comics will give you plenty of.
Yes.
But I just love the idea of, like, because it fits with the larger question that he's asking about the Reed Richards character, which is, if you're such a technocrat, does that mean you're susceptible to making horrible decisions based on just this utilitarian idea of the greater good? And so to show that you could have a Reed Richards who goes Nazi was totally fascinating and, weirdly in character, or at least a version of that character. And Hickman's brilliant. Hickman, although I tend to like his superhero stuff more than his non-superhero stuff.
Sure.
Not that I'm in any way dissing the non-superhero stuff. I just think he has such a mastery of the Marvel pantheon in a way that very few people do. I mean, it's like the obvious comparison is between him and Grant Morrison, and how Grant approaches the DC pantheon, where they just simultaneously have a love of this, kitschy, silly, initially designed for children genre, and yet at the same time don't disdain it, but at the same time don't disdain it, but also try to elevate it. And I mean, I still think Secret Wars was one of the most tremendous achievements that a superhero publisher has executed in recent years. I mean, it was such a big idea, and Hickman in the Hickman and Ribic. Is it Ribic or Ribich? I don't know how to.
I have no idea. I actually just did a podcast with Jason Aaron where he pronounced I always say Esad, but he said, I think he said like Esad, and I'm just like, I don't even know how to pronounce his first or last name. I feel bad. I've interviewed the guy. I should know better. But
I think it's Ribic, but anyway,
he's
whatever.
Croatian. I imagine it is Ribic.
Yeah, that's what I've assumed, but I guess I haven't spoken with him. But the Secret Wars miniseries, especially the first few issues, are of recent comics, some of the only issues that I go back and reread on a regular basis. I'm sure, like you, I have a giant stack of things to read, so unfortunately I don't get to go back and revisit things that often, but I will take time out if I need some inspiration and go look at some old Hickman Secret Wars, or also, like, I loved his New Avengers run. I mean, he's tremendous. And East of West is consistently one of the best comics on stands. I freaking love East of West. It's so weird.
It is.
It's so big. I barely understand anything that happens in it, but also you get the Dragata pencils and oh god, I'm blanking. Who's the colorist? Frank Martin, yes, who is of course one of the greats. So it's terrific. Anyway, that was a tangent, but I do have the idea number 101 tattooed on my forearm, and it was my first tattoo. So I tweeted about it when it happened, and Hickman tweeted at me and said, "This is bad luck because that series got canceled." But hey, it's coming back. I guess if that's what we're supposed to interpret from Marvel Legacy #1.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
I've heard things, but not things I can say here. But I would wager we'll see it in the future, relatively near future. But so believe it or not, that the solve everything was actually a very nice transition to what I want to talk to you about next, which is you've already mentioned this is kind of like a mantra for you to a degree, but I actually kind of feel like your feature writing and the way you approach it reflects that in a way, because when I look at all the different stuff you cover, when you just click on Abraham Riesman on Vulture and you go through all the stuff you do, it really feels like you're a writer who is deeply curious about a lot of topics and you just want to explore them, which is why you tackle everything from like Mr. Miracle and the explosion of kids comics to interviews with people like Ian McShane. And particularly I enjoy the fact that you got to go see Logan with Chris Claremont. That was amazing.
Yes, that was surprisingly easy. I had interviewed Claremont for a couple of articles. I wrote about Days of Future Past when X-Men, the Days of Future Past, the movie came out, and I interviewed him about Legion for a feature about Legion, the show. And so I had his email address, and then I just figured, why not? The worst he can say is no, and he lives in New York. So I just he actually lives very nearby to me in Brooklyn. So I just shot him an email and was like, do you want to go see Logan? I have a +1 for a critic screening. And he said yes. And it was a real experience. I mean, he was not as moved by the movie as I was, but it was taking the cab ride back with him was incredible because he is such. This is going to shock you. He's such a stickler for detail.
What?
He was like, I know. He was like, it seemed pretty implausible that they could get that limo with all the bullet holes across the border. And I was like, you are really focusing on something that feels secondary to what the movie was going for. But that's Chris Claremont. That's what makes him great, is he's really fixated on that stuff. That was a delight. I did embarrass myself in front of him because I will admit that I cried 3 times during Logan. I am not the dirty secret about me is I actually don't love superhero movies. I think a lot of them are just sort of mediocre action adventure films, but sure. Logan I thought was just Logan devastated me. I mean, I grew up my first real comic was X-Men number 69, which was Scott Lobdell and Carlos Pacheco, and I can't remember who did the colors, but it was the end of the Operation Zero Tolerance crossover. Bastion, exactly. And so the X-Men were my gateway drug, and so everybody turn off the podcast if you don't want to get spoiled on the last shot of Logan. But when Laura knocks over the cross to turn into the X, it was just a complete wreck. It was like this iconography. The iconography means so much to me. But yeah, Claremont was fun. Anyway, I'm sorry, I went off on
No,
another
it's
tangent.
okay. No, no. I was really hoping you were actually going to spoil Operation Zero Tolerance, and that's why you were saying that.
Yeah, they beat Bastion. The cavalry shows up. Shield saves everybody.
Oh, thank God, thank God. Well, I did want to ask though, in regards to the solve everything, if I'm reading too much into it thing, I am curious, like how much of your output is your curiosity driving you, and how much is assignment driven? It seems like it's more curiosity driven.
It's mostly curiosity driven at this point. There are things that get assigned to me, which is always very flattering. But, New York Magazine and Vulture are, New York Media LLC is the parent organization. It's a pretty small place. So, everybody's overworked, and that includes the editors. So, in order to get stuff published, you kind of have to be a self starter and tell people what you want to do. I do get assigned stuff, but the stuff that gets assigned to me generally is smaller issue. It'll be like, this movie's coming out, and do you want to write something about it? And then I have to come up with what the thing is. But I'm trying to think. Oh, this will be, when is this going to be published? This
This
podcast?
Monday, actually.
Monday. Okay, well, be on the lookout for this week. I have feature where I profiled Max Landis, and that was assigned to me. And I have rarely said yes to something as quickly as I did to that. I find that guy so fascinating. And so we hung out for a little while. But I'm trying to think. That's kind of the most recent story that was assigned to me. Like, this big article I just did about DC was my idea. Actually, more often than my editors assigning me things, it'll be I'll get an enticing pitch from a publicist.
Mm.
That's the one of the aspects of journalism that I feel like doesn't get talked about a whole lot in journalism school, because it feels
Icky.
unsexy and icky.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are good publicists out there who will come to you and say, do you want to interview blank? And it's just too good an opportunity to pass up. You're not going to say no just because a publicist proposed it. It's kind of all over the place, but I would say probably a majority, or at least a plurality, is stuff that I suggest.
I'm always curious though. It's like, do you know who Shea Serrano is?
Boy, that name sounds familiar. Who's Chase Serrano?
He did the book, the Rap Yearbook, and he's a writer for The Ringer. And
Yes.
Anyway, so I had him on my podcast, and we talked about his process and how he comes up with ideas, because people are always amazed by the ideas he comes up with. They're like so outside the box, and he actually like basically spends an entire day where he just like digests media and then comes up with ideas, and like that.
Oh, wow.
That's his day for idea creation. Do you have like an established process like that, or is it more kind of like the Claremont experience where you're just like, this would be kind of fun to call Chris or email Chris and see if you want to go to Logan with me?
It's closer to the latter. I mean, it's sort of stuff will occur to me. I mean, like, I have like actual diagnosed ADD, and so my brain will just hop all over the place. Well, I mean, I'll have my best ideas when I'm supposed to be researching something else.
Yes.
I'll be working on something and, reading a book about it, or reading a long article. And, to my great frustration, my brain will start to zone out a little bit, and I'll have to go reread a paragraph. But one of the reasons it might be zoning out is I'll be reading something and going, oh, this connects with something else. Or it'll be just one of those shower thoughts.
Yes.
Where I have absolutely no idea how it occurred to me. But yeah, I'll sit down and really brainstorm for something. Like, Blade Runner 2049 is coming out, and I knew that I wanted to write stuff about that. And I just sort of sat down at my office and went, okay, what are some interesting things about the Blade Runner mythology that I can write? But for the most part, stuff kind of comes to me, or it evolves over time. I mean, the DC article that I just wrote, that idea, evolved from, God, I guess when Rebirth happened, which was well over a year ago now. When Rebirth happened and DC pulled ahead in sales, or pulled ahead in orders. We don't know what the actual sales are.
But we might soon.
We might soon with Bookscan. But when it pulled ahead with Diamond orders, I remember thinking, like, I should try and interview Diane Nelson. Like, I should see, because Diane Nelson doesn't do many interviews. I'm curious what Diane Nelson's like and kind of her approach to how this all happened. Because, like, I was already going to interview Jeff Johns. He was doing that he did an event with some reporters in New York. But I was like, who is this Diane Nelson? Like, what is she actually like? What has her tenure been like? What do people think about working with her? And so that was, God, almost a year and a half ago or something. And then it was just sort of sticking in the back of my mind that I should write something about DC. And there was no real moment when it crystallized. It just sort of kept lingering in my mind that I should do some kind of large thing on DC, because there aren't that many. I mean, Sean Howe's book kind of obliterated for me the need to like do a comprehensive Marvel thing.
Right.
I mean, also Marvel is notoriously pretty tight-lipped. They are. I was surprised that you got as much access to them as you did, but they are, they can be. I mean, these are both corporate entities. You read old articles about journalists interacting with Marvel or DC, and it is astounding the kind of shit that they would just say on the record. Like,
yeah.
The other day, God, was it Rich Johnston? Somebody was bringing up the 2002 profile of Marvel that ran in the New York Observer, where Joe Quesada said that DC was like a porn star with the biggest schlong but couldn't get an erection.
Oh my God.
And it's like, can you imagine Joe Quesada saying something like that now as a Disney employee? Like, it's unimaginable. It could never happen. But like, there was this time when you could be a comics journalist, and it was such an informal kind of fly by night industry that you could just have weird chats with people. And, there are still people who will get weird with you, a few, but mostly this stuff is so carefully stage managed now. It can get a little frustrating, but anyway, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I tend to wonder how much, obviously the corporate element is huge. Like when they weren't owned by Disney, they could do whatever the hell they want. They could talk about DC schlong as much as they'd like. But
Yeah.
but the thing is I also kind of wonder how much of a factor like social media is, because back then I never heard of that. But if Joe Quesada said that today,
Yes.
everyone in comics would know in 5 minutes.
Yes.
Instantaneously.
Yes.
It would be out there.
Absolutely. And there's you. I thought you were just going to say that in the age of social media, if people are going to be wild, they just do it on Twitter, which
also true.
certainly does happen. Here, one sec. I'm going to pull up this exact quote. I really wanna find it. But okay, here we go. Who the fuck is DC anyway? Mr. Quesada said. They'd be better off calling it AOL Comics. At least people know what AOL is. I mean, they have Batman and Superman and they don't know what to do with them. That's like being a porn star with the biggest dick and you can't get it up. What the fuck?
God, that is
Isn't
amazing.
that insane? And it's a dream to get something like that. I have, the closest I ever got to something that incendiary was one of the first pieces of comics journalism I ever wrote. Was a profile of Mark Miller for the New Republic online.
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and he gave me this. I'm a huge admirer of Miller's work, and did not set out to write a hit job, and I don't think that the piece was a hit job. But the thing that everybody pulled from it was he said that about writing rape scenes, that it was just it's like a decapitation. It's a way to show that somebody's a bad guy, and that was a very rare moment in doing comics journalism where but the thing is, he's his own corporate entity. Like he's out there. He didn't have a publicist on the line. Like, he's Mark Miller. He can do whatever he wants. But
he's also a notoriously casual guy when it comes to stuff like that. He just kind of says what he thinks. And even though I think he's very good at playing the game, I still think he is a bit of a wild card in a way that few people are these days.
Yes, absolutely. And he plays it safer in his comics than he used to, but I'm sure that it comes from the same, the way that he used to write probably comes from the same level of like, he likes getting reactions out of people. And I'm sure that comes through in conversations that you have with him.
I kind of feel like Miller has entered his like nostalgic phase for his comics.
I don't love it. I mean, he does. I mean, Starlight was really
Starlight.
interesting. Starlight's great, but I don't know. Classic Miller, like the really insane provocateur stuff from the turn of the millennium, for me is just it was so formative,
Mm-hmm.
and for me it's like the superhero equivalent of EC Comics, where like he was just so good at figuring out how to push buttons while still constructing an interesting story. And I just, I wrote a piece a few months back about sort of revisiting the Ultimates, and
Mm-hmm.
I just the Ultimates is a stunning work. It's not as good as Watchmen, but it belongs in the same classes as Watchmen in terms of talking about the ins and outs of what's horrible about the archetype of the superhero.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess you can argue that he was, trying to have it both ways, because it can also just be read as kind of this edge lord thing where he's just trying to, poke at you. But I don't know. I maintain that the Ultimates is also this really excellent war on terror satire and breakdown of, especially volume two, breakdown of like the bad reasons that people like superhero stories. And anyway, but the point is, no one, Miller will maybe say something wild in an interview, but like the idea of Joe Quesada doing something like that is so funny to think about now.
Yeah, I do want to say that the underrated part about Ultimates is like people look at it in a lot of different ways these days, but sometimes they forget about the fact that it's just like a banging superhero joint. It is great.
Totally is. It's so exciting. I mean, it's Hitch and it's Laura Martin, and it is Laura Martin, right? Am I getting that right?
I
Or
think
am
it
I
is. I could be
I
mistaken.
think it is. I could be drawing a blank there, or getting that wrong. But Hitch's pencils were unlike anything that I'd ever seen. I mean, he had obviously done a terrific job in Stormwatch and on the Authority, but he really outdid himself once he had the opportunity to play around with the Marvel characters and to do all these costume redesigns. And yeah, it's
It
just.
totally popularized widescreen comics in a way. I mean,
Oh,
the Authority just didn't have the reach for it. I love the Authority. I am ride or die with the Authority, but
yeah, me too.
I really think Ultimates did that, and it was Laura Martin.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. God, as Grant Morrison once said of Laura Martin, she has God's own paint box. She's just. Um, I met Laura Martin at a con at San Diego a few years ago, and I was so starstruck because I think she's so incredible. And she had a little booth in Artist's Alley, and I just rambled for like 10 minutes about all of the work that she's done that I love. And she sort of sat there patiently and listened, and then at the end was like, "Thanks. So you buy anything or?" Like, not, it wasn't rude. I was just like, yeah, that's a good point. She can't eat esteem, but so I bought an A-Force poster that she signed. But anyway, sorry, I keep rambling
No,
on and
no,
on.
no, no. We'll get back on track. I really want to ask a question about. I'm curious about your background and what your path to writing for a living was. Like, I know you went to Harvard, but I don't think you went to school for journalism though, did you?
I did not. There was no journalism program at Harvard, but I was on the school paper, the Crimson. I had sort of a weird route to journalism. It wasn't something I grew up wanting to do. I mean, my one of my favorite writers growing up was Roger Ebert. I'm from Chicago, and I would just obsessively read everything he wrote in the Sun Times. So arts journalism, or at least writing about the arts, was something that from an early age I cared a lot about. But when I was very young, I thought I wanted to be an actor, and I got to college and found out that I really hated dealing with actors. Like at a certain point, I'm told it kind of comes around again when you get significantly older, and actors are actually the ones who survive are nice people. But so I didn't want to do acting anymore, but I was having trouble coming up with something else to do as like my dream, because it had kind of taken this hole, or created this hole in me by taking that away. So I thought, it's college. You can kind of just try new things with extracurricular activities at no additional cost to yourself. So I thought, what if I try writing some articles for the arts section of the Crimson?
Mm-hmm.
And so I started doing that, and then ended up being an editor there at the arts section. And I'm deeply embarrassed about everything that I wrote while I was there. I wrote one comics thing that was so incoherent. It was just like ways in which comics kind of relate to Harvard. Where like there was a big comics collection at one of the libraries, and God, I'm trying to remember. They were like, it was just completely disconnected things that sort of had to do with comics, and it was like the thesis was just Harvard and comics overlap in some ways, which is in no way an interesting argument for a piece. But when it comes to writing about like comics and geek things, that was a very circuitous route because when I in college, I interned for public radio stations. I thought I wanted to be a public radio host, and then found out that that's a very difficult job to get. And it was before the podcast era really took off. And then when I graduated college, I got a job writing for a newspaper that now no longer exists called the New York Sun. They went out of business 3 months after I started working there. And I was a city reporter there, not an arts reporter. I was like writing about, I mean, this place was so on its last legs that they made me their crime reporter for like a few weeks right near the end, just because like it was a weird place.
I mean, comics are filled with crime. Clearly, you know that already.
But crime does not pay. Sorry, I'm trying to get my cat not to jump on my computer so this doesn't get cut off. Timmy, this is my cat who is named Tim Drake.
That is amazing. That's
Tim
great.
Drake. I have
the best Robin.
The best Robin. I have two cats. There's Tim Drake and Barbara Gordon. I just call them Tim and Barbara. And so I got this job at the Sun. Sun went out of business. I started doing freelance copywriting for anchors to read at a local news station called New York One. Then I produced a weekly profile and interview series at New York One, and then left that and worked in marketing for a while, then was freelancing. And it's just, I then got a job doing video for New York Magazine, which is how I started working for my current employer, but was not hired as a writer. Then started writing on the side for them, and they liked the writing. And then eventually that was like half of what I was doing. And then after a while of that, I just, of doing both things, I just asked my boss, could I just be a writer? And they said yes. So it's one of those classic examples of like, if like journalism student asks me like, what advice do you have? I'm like, oh boy, this is such a hard like road to recreate. Like, the only advice I can have is just never think you actually know what's going to happen next in your career, because a place can go out of business, or you can get an unexpected job, or like you can get a job and then parlay that into doing something else at the same institution. So that's the hastily version of my career. But I've been a full-time staff writer for New York Mag and Vulture since March of last year. So it's actually been a relatively short time that this has been my specific job.
I do want to take one thing that you said in there and say, like, it would be really good advice if you shared with somebody. One thing that I think is impressive about you is, you write, you talked about the video work you did and possibly still do on occasion. You also do photography work, or at least according to your website.
Occasionally, very rarely,
but you have the skill in your back pocket. I do think in 2017 it's more important than ever to have a varied skill set where you can
absolutely
where you can bring multiple skills to the table. Where, like, I think one thing that kind of, not to tout myself, which is kind of an awkward thing to do, but I mean, like, I'm very good with data. And so I can use that. I can use that with my writing, and it provides an angle that not many people do. But if you can do video, if you're a good photographer, or you can do editing, if you can, even in doing like coding, or like the ability to do things of that sort, is extremely helpful, because it's, most places are going to have you load your own content, or possibly load your own content onto like WordPress or some other CMS. So that stuff is helpful. I do think, how important do you think it is to have a varied skill set these days?
Oh, unbelievably. I mean, I'm living proof. I mean, I wouldn't have this job if I mean, I guess there's a possibility I could have gotten this job just as a writer initially, but I only got this because I was the video guy, which I loved doing in a lot of ways. But after a certain point, I just had this opportunity. I was a self-starter, and the first piece, I believe it was the first piece that I wrote for them was, or certainly the first piece of any significance, is one I'm very kind of embarrassed by now, because it was a classic just sort of hot take where I was like, the MCU isn't diverse enough, which arguably at the time it wasn't. This was 2013, but like it was just it was so facile. Like but then again, I don't know. It's a relatively recent development that you get mainstream media outlets writing about this
Right.
geek stuff like this. So it got a fair amount of pickup, I think, just because it was comparative, at least compared to
It
now,
was a big outlet talking
unusual.
about something they don't normally talk about.
Right, exactly. So and the MCU was really starting to blow up at that point. I believe it was pegged to the premiere of Agents of Shield,
Mm-hmm.
and I wouldn't. The other thing to tell prospective people is like try and follow your passions. That's sort of related to having a varied skill set, but like this stuff that I get to write about, I never would have imagined I could be able to write about. And just a few years ago, I don't think anybody would, like
No.
10 years ago, no one would have hired, somebody at a major publication to do this kind of stuff full time. But now we live in this world where this passion that I've had, I always joke, not really joke, it's actually kind of an issue. I don't really have any hobbies anymore because my hobby
Have become your
is
job.
my job. It's become my job. So I'm kind of always at risk of overheating because even on my leisure time, I've upped the amount of literary fiction that I read just because now literary fiction is like my escape.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like comics used to be my guilty pleasure, and now I have to like, comics just I'm constantly thinking about like, should I be turning this into a story? Like, is this creator on the up and up? Like, if I like this, should this go into my monthly comics to read recommendation column? But yeah, that's you could not be more on the money. You absolutely have to have a varied skill set these days. I know very few writers who got their jobs just by like being noticed as a good writer. You have to also be a good, at the very least, self-promoter, which is its
Mm-hmm.
own skill, and you really have to develop your ability to do that. That does not come naturally. You have to learn how to be able to put yourself out there without being, irritating to everybody involved. Which at least that's something that comics creators share that struggle. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's something that journalists and comics creators can relate about is we're underpaid and we have to promote our own work despite the fact that we are being published by other places. I'm not dissing New York Magazine. They do a great job of promoting, but like it's such a crowded media environment that you have to be your own publicist.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
want to talk about that here in a second, but I do want to really quick bring up you talked about how you're embarrassed by like the first thing you wrote. I think that is like an absolutely necessary thing to happen to you because
Yes.
the very first like long form I attempted, and I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, was an abject disaster. I was so proud of it. I thought it was amazing, and I like my big inspiration for writing like long forms, like analytical comic stuff is Coming Alone, which was a column that Warren Ellis wrote for CBR
Yes,
back in
of
like
course.
2000.
Yes.
Yeah, that is like my jam. And when I wrote the piece, I was so proud of it. I tweeted it to Warren Ellis, and he's not very communicative on Twitter, but he took
No.
time from me, and he told me that I was staggeringly wrong. And I was like,
Oh
it
no.
was a living nightmare. I was like, oh no, what have I done? And
Uncle Warren doesn't like me.
yeah,
Oh, that.
but the funny thing is afterwards he sent other tweets, and he was actually very encouraging. He was like, I appreciate what you're trying to do. This is a disaster, but keep doing it and get better. And I was like, I can do that. I can definitely do that.
Yeah.
So
Hey, good
yeah,
job, Warren.
yeah. I mean, he didn't say it in so many words, but at the same time, it was this really big moment for me because like I realized, wow, that was terrible. I really should have thought this through better, and I need to be better. I got to get better.
Yes.
And then beyond that, it also encouraged me because I was like, I should do this because clearly there's value there because even Warren Ellis can see it, and so I'm going to keep doing this. And it was just this
Yes.
weird firebrand moment. I think a lot of times people get so buried by disappointment or like bad responses that they don't realize that that's like one step closer to getting to where you need to be.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Brian K. Vaughan once told me that nobody likes a nervous pilot, so you should never like totally admit your weaknesses. But like, I am constantly worried that my next piece is going to be derided. But like, you shouldn't let that overtake your ability to write. You shouldn't let your fear completely dominate you. But having that fear allows you to self edit to a certain degree, and B you can have that fear and still say, you know what, even if this does turn out to be something that I'm embarrassed by, it's a step forward. Now, the trouble is like, the trouble with journalism is it's also public,
Right.
that sometimes failing in public is pretty humiliating. It's not like you have a desk job and you didn't do a great job with a spreadsheet and it's only going to be seen internally and people will probably forget about it pretty quickly. The internet is forever. Like if you write a bad article, unless it's so bad that it gets taken down and then it becomes even more infamous,
It's who you are
it,
now.
it's right. It's going to be around. And so, there's always that risk that the next thing that you write will, utterly humiliate you. But no, I think you're completely right. You I mean, if Warren Ellis is telling you to keep writing, I often think about Warren. God, I think he wrote this on his Live Journal a million years ago that like, um, writer's block doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
You just write. Like a writer is someone who writes. You just keep going, and some days the stuff you write is going to be garbage, but you just need to keep putting words on a page. And I know that sounds banal, but I guess you probably wouldn't be surprised, but a lot of aspiring writers will just say, I have writer's block, or like I'm trying to write this perfect article, and I'm always like, don't write a perfect article, just write an article. Like you'll maybe get to a perfect article at some point, but it's much more important to just keep the pump primed and keep writing, and eventually you'll start to create great stuff. But you can't predict what stories are going to be great.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the underrated part too is if there's other things you can do when you're not if you're not feeling it. Like for me, like I know you tweeted you were working on an oral history piece, and
Yes.
I'm sure you can't talk about it. But the thing is like if like let's say you're not feeling it, you can go in there and start organizing those things and looking through the quotes, and then next thing you know, you're pumped to write again, and like you start
That
getting in there and
yes.
and doing that, and like that's the thing is like there's other things you can do to kind of remotivate you to find that. Whether that, I mean, honestly, like this is a very atypical thing to like motivate somebody, but there's every once in a while I'll be on Twitter and I'll see something that somebody tweets and I'm like, that's an article. Why is that not an article? And
Yes.
then I turn it into an article, and
That was
it's
that happened to
interesting.
me. No, it is interesting. That happened to me with there's a really excellent writer and nice guy named Jaime Weinman who doesn't hang out on Twitter anymore, but he tweeted that he'd noticed that sales were better for Harley Quinn. This was years ago, for Harley Quinn than any other female-led superhero title,
Mm-hmm.
title at all. And I reached out to him to ask for permission, but I just saw that tweet and was like, I should write a long piece about Harley Quinn, and I did, and it ended up being one of the most successful pieces I had written to that point. And like, yeah, you can allow your mind to wander, follow what you find interesting, because the reader will be able to see that passion come through. Wow, this is really turning into us just giving inspirational poster advice about
Pretend we're cats. That would probably help.
Yes,
Helpful
exactly.
cat
There we go.
posters.
That's me every day. I am a cat father, so I some of it rubs off on me. But anyway, I agree with everything you're saying.
So, before we get into your DC article, I want to mention one thing or talk about one thing you were talking about before, which was social media. And I think, it is interesting because you're talking about for writers and how comic art or comic creators, like it's necessary, but it is so necessary for all types of content creators these days. I hate that word
Yeah.
content. I hate boiling down comics to
No,
content
I
or
know,
TV to
but I
content.
know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. But I am curious, like, do you think it's possible to be a modern journalist without a social media presence?
Oh God, that is the great question. On multiple occasions, I have tried to either quit Twitter or like take a sabbatical, and it's just very addictive. I mean, not
Totally.
like I have to tell you, but B, you know, it's the best way I have found to self promote. I
Yep.
mean, there are articles that I have done that simply would not have. I mean, I guess I can't go back in time and do an experiment to see both ways, but there are so many articles I've written that have only done good traffic or gotten attention because I was promoting them on Twitter. That was just the stage. And you look at the data when we have traffic reports at Vulture, and a lot of these stories, the main referral source is Twitter, and the stories that I write, and it I wish it didn't pay off as much as it does, because it just ends up taking up way more time than it's net probably worth,
Mm-hmm.
in aggregate. But I, unfortunately, I think it is sort of the place where you have to promote, and it's also an important place to be for comics, because there are a lot of industries. Twitter is not that important, but again, not like I have to tell you or any of your listeners, but comics creators love Twitter. I mean, they are I mean, not all of them, but you get there's a lot that you learn. And comics Twitter with a capital C, capital T, can be incredibly aggravating, but there is a lot of you get a wide array of perspectives, and
Mm-hmm.
there are people who are putting themselves out there that whose voices I wouldn't necessarily have found if they weren't getting retweeted and entering into conversations. And a lot of voices from people who are not straight white men. I mean, that's where they get heard, even more so than sometimes like the sites that they write for. Like you'll see somebody who comes from a perspective that is marginalized in society, and that person can write a blog post or write an article for a site, and it may or may not get a lot of attention. But if you can say something really smart and incendiary within a Twitter thread, that is often going to be the place where I end up seeing the thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's and it might be the place where other people see the thing, and then you start getting more attention and you can write for bigger outlets. It's just comics, the comics world and the journalism world are both obsessed with Twitter, so of course that leads to me having a real addiction
Right.
with the medium.
I do think that I talked about this. I was a guest on this podcast that like looks at media, and we were talking about comics journalism or the state of it. And I talked about how and I think that one of the interesting things about comics journalism right now, and I think that this is kind of the way that the larger journalism works or world works too. But I think it's interesting how, because so many of the sites that are comic sites are kind of, they have low consumer faith,
Yeah.
that
Yes.
that I think that a lot of people are starting to follow the people who they trust, to like that. You can follow Oliver Sava on Twitter and you can know that
Yes.
he's gonna say awesome things, or you can follow Zainab Akhtar and she's gonna have awesome things to say.
Yes.
So you follow the people, you don't follow the brands anymore. And I don't know if that's ever gonna go that way in the larger journalism scape, because there's always gonna be places like New York Magazine or like the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever. But it is interesting where
There's a lot of people who their voices are more important sometimes. I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to diss any institutions, but there are definitely places where, you know, no one is going to, very few people go to the homepage of the site, but they'll get a lot of traffic because they have that one writer who is just so brilliant, or at least has their finger on the pulse, that people will find them through Twitter and read their articles because they have that voice that's either distinctive, pardon me, or reliable or intelligent, or
mm-hmm.
some combination of the three. And yeah, Oliver's a great example. Like, I don't read everything that the AV Club puts out, but I certainly read, pretty much everything that Oliver writes and tweets out. Same with at the AV Club, like, Tegan O'Neill does great stuff there. But like, I don't have an RSS feed set for everything the AV Club does. Not dissing the AV Club. It's just there's so much media out there to consume that, the voices there end up being what I pay attention to more than the whole institution as itself.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I want to transition into your DC piece. The
Yeah.
last week when this runs, you ran a piece about DC Entertainment, Jeff Johns, Diane Nelson, and the story behind the changes, like the change in emphasis on the film side of things. And
Yeah.
I thought it was a great and very revealing piece. I'm really curious. What was the development of that piece? I know you've kind of already touched on it a bit, but was it something you pitched your team on and built from there?
Yeah. Yes, I pitched the head of our culture coverage, for print and online. Really amazing guy named Lane Brown, who's been a real mentor in some ways. I just went to him. God, this was months ago. It's supposed to have been in the spring, and just said, "Would you be interested in me doing a story about DC Entertainment?" And laid it out for him a little bit, and he trusts me enough. I'm lucky enough that he trusts me enough that that he said yes, just go forth, pursue it. And you know, without getting into too many details of how it works behind the scenes, it was tough to pull off because, as we were saying, DC is owned by Warner Brothers slash Time Warner. I mean, this is a place that is very not fly by night.
Right.
This is not, you are grabbing an interview with some self-published comics writer who just has a Gmail address. You are going through a lot of levels of clearance, and it was that part of it was tough to pull off. And also, these are very busy people. I mean, tracking down Jeff Johns for an interview, as your listeners are going to be familiar with the Jeff Johns reputation as being a workhorse and having a lot of irons in the fire at one time. He's a tough guy to pin down for an interview. And so it was a challenge. It took me many months to put together. There was a lot of laying the groundwork of doing completely off the record interviews to kind of feel out what the story might be, and then talking with people at DC that in a non-interview capacity, but just talking to publicists and figuring out ways that we could make this happen. It's a delicate dance when you're because you want to be able to get the access, but you are a journalist. You don't want to compromise the fact that you are looking for the truth. And not that I think there's some horrific truth at the core of the DC Entertainment employs Oompa Loompa slave labor thing, but you want to report the truth, but journalism in 2017 across the board is something that involves a lot of gatekeepers. This is just, you talk to older journalists for any topic, and they will tell you it didn't used to be this way. There just weren't publicity as a profession was not what it is now. 25 years ago, even it was much. I mean, you hear stories about calling up famous actors because their names were in the phone book. That's a very long time ago. But
I mean, look at the Joe Quesada quote you dropped earlier.
Yeah, exactly. That's only 2002.
And Marvel was not a small company before being owned by Disney. I mean, it's not like they were unknown.
No, but once you are owned by Disney, there are protocols, I'm sure.
Yes.
I mean, and it's it can be frustrating at times, but game recognized game.
It's part of the process.
It's part of the process, and I have a lot of respect for a good publicist is somebody who I will have a lot of respect for. It's not an easy profession because you have to balance so many people's needs and interests while making it seem like everything's hunky-dory all the time, and that's no easy task to pull off. And journalists can sniff out if you're giving them BS, so you have to be able to convey something that is beneficial to your employer, but also not, just blatantly lying to someone. And it's a really tough thing to pull off. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for a lot of the publicists that I've interacted with in the past. And so the DC story was something I came to the culture editor with. And it evolved a lot over time. And, I did a couple of the big main interview was one I did at San Diego Comic-Con with Jeff Johns, Diane Nelson, Jim Lee, Dan DiDio, and it was interesting. There was a lot of stuff that I really was. They weren't Joe Quesada in the New York Observer interview, but they told me a lot of behind the scenes stuff, and I appreciate that they were so open with me. But it was another person was Amit Desai was also there. Sorry, I should have mentioned him as well. But it was my favorite thing I learned there at that interview was something that didn't make it into the article because it was so niche. But I tweeted about this. Dan revealed that the New 52, they came up with that number pretty much arbitrarily. Like they were at 48 titles, and then Jim Lee said we should go up to 52, and
because of the book.
Because of 52, which had been over for a while at the point, but he was just like, yeah, why not? People liked that number. And then, like, of course, as you have written eloquently about in the past, it's so funny because then they locked themselves into this publishing volume that they had to be at 52 titles.
Right.
And that was perhaps detrimental to them. But it was just this kind of arbitrary decision. And this is one of the things I love about comics is even though you have the big two owned by these mega corporations, it is still this very what's the word I'm looking for? There are these interesting personalities and decisions. It's a lot of times it is kind of an auteur's medium because there are so few. It's comparatively so cheap and personnel light to make a comic book. So unlike a movie or a television program, you can really have just random individual decisions like that end up having huge consequences.
Right.
I mean, especially when it comes to like character creation or developing a story that then, the character or the story end up being in a movie or a TV show. Like you can just have these totally random ideas that people just come up with one day, and then they end up being bajillion-dollar properties. I mean, like
look at Groot.
Look at Groot.
He's
exactly.
a fucking tree, and now he's like stuffed animal. I went to the Funko Pop headquarters in Everett, Washington last week, and they had so much Groot stuff. It was unbelievable. I'm like, this is a tree, a walking tree that hadn't been in comics for 40 years, and now he's like on t-shirts. Like they had like 5 t-shirts that were just Groot. It was amazing. But I want to talk about the New 52 thing. Well, first off, I think I would love to have been in the room when they were trying to come up with books 49 through 52 because I feel like they'd be like, shit, we should have went with 48. This is really hard. GI Combat, I guess. Men of War. I don't know. Oh, I regret this. But I think one thing that people don't realize about the features like that is, there's the old analogy of like you look at like the glacier and you see the glacier on top, but then there's way more glacier underneath. Like there's way more that you don't see that goes into a piece than it does otherwise. How hard was it to find, like, full disclosure, Abraham interviewed me for the piece and I was not in it.
And you're no,
that's fine. But
but you were in it very close to the end. Like basically it was like the final cut. I had a really good quote from you in there that was very descriptive about Jeff Johns and his impact on the industry. And I always feel bad that there are these people who take time out of their day to talk to me for an interview, and then you just can't end up using everybody. An article, I mean, it wouldn't flow well. People would get bored if you had every single interview. But like, I interviewed a ton of people who are involved in DC Entertainment or who have perspectives on DC Entertainment for this article, and people who didn't end up in there. And it feels terrible. They were nice enough to talk to me, but unfortunately, that's the hustle, and a lot of it, even people think that because it's online, you have unlimited space, but like a good editor will realize that there's only limited brain space that the average reader has, so you have to cut it down. I mean, my original draft of, the first draft I handed in of DC Entertainment was like 7,500 words or something, and even that felt way too short. Like I had just accumulated so much information, but people don't. The average reader, the lay reader for Vulture.com and for New York Magazine is not necessarily going to be fascinated by like all of the ins and outs of like how Supergirl got pitched. And luckily you can hold on to interviews for other things.
Right.
So, hopefully I'll be able to use a lot of the good stuff that I learned. Or like, I had interviews with like Sefton Hill and Ed Boon about the video games, and it just didn't end up working for the flow of the piece. And
well, even beyond that, it's like you didn't. It's not like you went in knowing you were going to do a piece like that was primarily about the movies. It was like you wanted to cover all these bases, and then it became this because that's just the way that things work sometimes.
That's the way things work sometimes. Exactly. I wanted to tell a holistic story, and I did my best to have that still be somewhat the case. But you can't. It's not a math problem. You can't just sit down and go like, I'm going to devote an equal amount of time to every person I talked to every aspect of the operation of this company. And of course, there's the stuff that your editor is interested in, which might not be the same as the stuff you're interested in, but your editor's your editor, and it can be this one was there were a lot of moving parts for this article. I'm happy with how it came out, but I'm kind of glad that it's over, just because it kind of ate up my life for a number of months, and now I can finally move on to other things that I'm excited about doing.
Yeah.
And I will tell you what the oral history that I was working on, and this one took a long time as well. But it's an oral history of Batman the Animated Series that will be coming.
Oh my God.
Soon. That was a complete delight to do. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to come out, but I mean, I'm done. I finished the draft, and it was, let me tell you, having a phone conversation with Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill
must be so distracting. You're like, Batman?
I know, especially weirdly, it was more distracting with Conroy, even though Hamill, is also Luke Skywalker. Like, Conroy, you mainly just associate with the one role, but like, it's a pretty singular voice, man.
Yeah.
Like you're hearing, and the Bruce Wayne voice is not far off from his actual voice. And and as any geek who has talked to Kevin Conroy can tell you, that voice makes you starstruck in a way that even meeting like really huge famous movie stars
Christian
sometimes.
Bale, who played Batman.
Yeah,
you never know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But
I have a prediction to make. That will be your most popular article you've ever written.
You think?
I think so, by like actually a considerable margin. Batman the Animated Series. So Sean Gordon Murphy has this new book coming out, Batman White Knight.
Yes,
and
very excited about it. Yeah.
I actually have a prediction. I predicted this on my Patreon. I think it's going to be the #1 selling comic of the year, and not because it's Batman. Well, it is because it's Batman, but because he's positioning it so closely to the animated series. He's using the whole Mr. Freeze like storyline with like the wife and everything, which came from, what was it, Heart of Ice?
Heart of Ice, the Paul Dini Heart of Ice, yeah.
Exactly. Like, I mean, we're right in this period where so many creators and so many people who are like in like the, 22 to like 40 age group love that series with a fiery passion. And
the reason that I got to do the piece was one of our senior editors at the magazine, like on the print side, he barely does anything for online. This is a guy who's very high up, who I have an enormous amount of respect for. Basically just one day said like, and is not a geek, like he's not necessarily like one of us. He read a piece that I wrote about Batman, and he sent me an email and was like, you should write about Batman the Animated Series. That series was great. I watched every episode of it. And like, he's a little older than me, but like, for a lot of people, that was not just their introduction to Batman, but that is the definitive Batman. And it's not just the definitive Batman, but for a lot of people, it's like sort of the definitive perfect corpus of superhero storytelling. I mean, not perfect. There are episodes.
It's as perfect as you can get for most people, though.
It's about as perfect as you can get. I mean, that the first 2 seasons are. In revisiting a lot of episodes for this oral history, what struck me was I didn't have to revisit them. I remembered them beat for beat. Like Heart of Ice, I remembered everything that I was. I rewatched it, but while I was watching it, I was like, I didn't have to this stuff lodged it. I mean, like I don't have to rewatch Almost Got Him. Like I know everything that happens in Almost Got Him. It's a perfect Batman story. I saw it at a young, impressionable age, and when I was doing these interviews, I barely had to prep. I mean, I would do obviously my research, but like I know this corpus so backwards and forwards because you're exactly right. For this generation, for this sect of geekery, that was it was a touchstone. And I mean, you flatter me. I hope people end up liking it, but people did tell me a lot of interesting stuff that I won't reveal. But it was a wild place to work. I mean, not like, people like doing coke in the bathrooms, but there was such a an energy that people had while they were coming up with this stuff. And like, them doing Mask of the Phantasm while they were doing the
Right.
second season, like, and Mask of the Phantasm being, one of the best Batman movies ever made.
Mm-hmm.
Like my great joy was I got to talk to Kevin Conroy and Andrea Romano, the voice director, the great unsung hero of the DC animated universe. I got to talk to both of them about what I consider to be one of the greatest Batman lines ever written in any medium. When Bruce in the flashback goes to his parents' graves and says, "I never counted on being happy." Like it's one of the all-time smartest takes on that character. Like,
Mm-hmm.
can a Batman who, and this is something that now you see Tom King playing with, where it's
Right.
like, can you have a happy Batman? Like, will we as the reader metatextually allow Batman to ever find any kind of peace? And the answer is kind of no. We're terrible to this person.
It's like
Like,
it's like Spider-Man being successful. I mean, we're seeing that in comics right now, and some people are kind of
yeah,
revolting against it. It's like Spider-Man shouldn't be running a company. This is ridiculous.
right.
But he's bad at it, so it kind of makes sense.
It kind of makes sense, right? Exactly.
Okay, so I want to close with a couple quick questions about interviews, and then I like to do this a finale where it's 5 quick questions about you as a
Sure.
person rather than what you do. But so I wanted to ask about interviews because I think you're a phenomenal interviewer. You often do a good job of tapping into topics the person you're interviewing rarely gets to address. Like your Steve Zahn interview was awesome because you talked to him about farming and his local theater company in Kentucky, which are 2 things I didn't even know he did. Not that
Yeah.
I mean, not that I like am reading every interview that Steve Zahn does, but it's not exactly, you don't associate that with Lenny from That Thing You Do.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what do you think makes a good interview?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I think, one big thing that I learned from a history professor I had in college who was talking about how to run a discussion. He told me avoid yes or no questions. That's one of the biggest things you can possibly teach somebody is if you ask a yes or no question, you always run the risk that the person's just going to say no, and that's the end of that part of the conversation. And any no, any singular no, can really disrupt the flow of any kind of chat that you're having with someone.
Yeah.
So keeping questions open-ended, like instead of saying did you blank, it's as simple as saying to what extent did blank affect you or whatever, because once you say to what extent, then the person literally can't say the word yes or no, because that's not a proper response to that question. I mean, they can, but the brain doesn't work that way. Instead, they will say, I would say like to a large extent, or like, not really all that much. And
Yeah.
the difference between not really all that much and no is huge for the way the interview flows, I think.
Well, not only
So
that, but I think they're going to naturally elaborate from there.
exactly, or at least you have a better chance that they will. So that's one thing. Another is just obviously, do your research and always, I always like to start out, or at least early on in an interview, ask something that is, you are a great example of this. You brought up my tattoo right up at the top. Like I recently interviewed Darren Aronofsky, and my first question was about the actor Mark Margolis, who plays Tio on Breaking Bad and
Oh,
Better
yeah,
Call
yeah.
Saul. Because Margolis is in every Darren Aronofsky movie except for Mother, and I was interviewing Aronofsky about Mother, and I was like, "Where's Mark Margolis?" And it's a great way to start because it demonstrates to the person that you're not just going to sit around and ask the generic questions,
Right.
and B, you want to make sure it's something that's offbeat, but something that they care about, because then, it just puts them at ease. And
Yeah, it disarms them from the start.
it disarms them from the start. I'm trying to think. I did one like that when I interviewed Neil Gaiman. I started out with something like that, and I can't. I think it was just talking about Judaism. Like no, it couldn't have been that because that's too on the money. Well, anyway, I can't remember, but I try to come out swinging with something that's a little odd and not just, so how'd you get involved in the project? I mean, sometimes you only have so much time. If you're
So you
doing
got to
like
get
a
straight to the
con
meat of
interview,
it.
yeah, sometimes you have 10 minutes with somebody and you can't dilly dally. But I'm very lucky that New York Magazine encourages me to have long interviews with people. And I'm
Sure.
lucky that New York Magazine has enough of a reputation that there will be places that it's a place where publicists or individuals that you're interviewing will agree to do a long interview. And yeah, the Steve Zahn thing was one of the great joys of my recent existence. I adored talking to Steve Zahn. He was the nicest guy. He loved talking about his farm, loved talking about local theater, loved talking about that thing you do. He
Yeah.
was not, and he was in no way put off by the fact that I wanted to bring that up as much as I wanted to talk about War for the Planet of the Apes. But yeah, I would say coming at it with something slightly unexpected to put them at ease and avoiding yes or no questions are two things that I kind of I try to bring to every interview I do.
I always find that for interviewers, it seems like you want to find interviewers whose style you kind of enjoy, and like not that you should emulate them completely, but like kind of take like here's a good example. Like, did you read Mark Anthony Green's interview with Aziz Ansari in GQ? That was like
No.
it's really
Did I?
good.
Okay.
It's really good, and like I just remember reading that, and I was just like, man, like this like touches on all the stuff I want to talk about. Maybe a little bit more on the fashion side because Aziz Ansari and Mark Anthony Green are far more fashionable than I am, but it's
Yeah.
like it had such a good natural flow because it felt more like a conversation that was hitting all the beats that you would want an interview of that sort to do while
Yeah.
still feeling organic. And
Yeah.
and that's tough.
It's tough, and there are a lot of times I have gone out there, taken a swing and completely whiffed. But when you have the right, I mean, when that connection happens, it's it's utter magic. It's the reason you get up in the morning. I mean, I did this long interview with Neil Gaiman a few months back when American Gods was about to start, and it was just one of the great moments of my life. I mean, I haven't got it, and I'm not saying that to like gush over Neil Gaiman. It was more just that the conversation just went so well,
Mm-hmm.
and he was open. We had a lot of time, and we got to talk about again what I consider to be one of the great Batman stories, whatever happened to the Cape Crusader, which I feel like doesn't get discussed nearly enough. His two-parter after Batman R.I.P. But anyway, I can't remember what the question was, but
It's fine. It's fine. Well, actually, we got to jump into the 5 questions about
let's
Abraham
do it.
Riesman, the person. And these are the questions that are typically most important to me because I just think they're super fun and random. I wanted to start with a question about a tweet you made yesterday, and
Uh-oh.
you said on Twitter that Blade Runner 2049 made you wish there was a Dread sequel. I love Dread. Dread was
I
amazing.
love Dread. Yeah.
It was awesome. I This is gonna be a very difficult question for you though. Who was more essential to Dread being as good as it is? Carl Urban or Lena Headey?
Oh boy, is that tough. Oh my God. Ooh, I mean, probably because the trouble with you're tempted to say, well, obviously Carl Urban because Judge
He is
Dredd,
Dread.
has right, he's Dredd, but as has been pointed out by so many, the core of the reason the Judge Dredd mythology has lasted so long is because the best Judge Dredd stories are not about Dredd. They're about the world that he lives in and the world that people
Mm-hmm.
like him have created. So I'm going to go with Lena. I mean, she's so you
Terrifying.
know, she's utterly terrifying. And also, that movie is just the best ode to slow mo that I've ever seen in my life. I mean,
The drug has
it's
even called it.
yes, it's like, I mean, watching that movie is like being on drugs. I love it. And I can't say anything about Blade Runner 2049, but there is one shot near the beginning that anyone who sees it who is familiar with not, just the movie Dread, but Judge Dredd at all, any of that imagery will just go like, "Oh, come on." Jesus Christ! Why don't you just toss a few bucks the way of 2000 AD? But anyway, okay. Next question.
Okay, so this is a more broad question, but I always have to ask it because I'm obsessed with food. What's at the top of your personal breakfast power rankings? What is your ideal breakfast situation?
Oh, ooh. Well, there's ideal and there's what I actually eat because I'm on Weight Watchers lately. So I've been eating
Let's go with ideal then.
ideal. Got to go with a stack of pancakes. I know it's boring, but like just something, pancakes that are freshly done, just have the slightest bit of crisp on the
Oh
top and the
yeah.
bottom. Yeah, and are freshly syruped. I hardly ever do it, but if I have a last meal, that's what I go for probably.
All right. So next question. You've had. I mean, it's amazing the access you've had as a journalist. Partially because New York Magazine, but also just I'm sure you have your own reputation out there. But one of the things is, I think journalists always secretly envy each other for the stuff that they get to do.
Oh yeah.
If you could pick one, which piece do you think generated the most "damn you" from other journalists? And I have something
Oh.
specific in mind.
Huh. One that generated the most honestly late most recently the one that leaps to mind was Darren Aronofsky, because I did not negotiate that was New York Magazine, but I got to be the first journalist who saw Mother, and there were a lot of people who were very jealous of the fact that I got to see it as early as I did. That was not due to me being I can't brag about that. That was very much New York Magazine having a reputation. But I'm trying to think, is there another one that makes people say "damn you"?
My one was
Oh,
Children of Men. My God, I
oh
was so
yes.
envious.
Oh, yeah, that was the biggest passion project. I almost feel sad that I did that article now, because I can't do that article again. That was like something my whole life for the previous 10 years had kind of been building up to. And that was getting to fly to Mexico City to spend 2.5 hours with Alfonso Cuarón was one of the most amazing things that's ever happened to me in my life, and I'm extremely lucky and blessed.
I have to say, I just watched that movie again recently. It's one of my favorite movies ever.
Yeah.
I actually think it's better now. I don't know how. Like rewatching it, like it's
Yeah.
most movies, kind of slightly degrade the more times you see them. Man, that movie still kills it. Like there's something
Yeah.
about that, especially, obviously where we are today, it feels even more powerful and it's incredible.
Yep. Yep. Has not lost. It's a perfect movie in my opinion. I you know just Google Children of Men. You'll find my article, and I don't want to be
I'll
redundant
put
to
it in
it,
the
but
show
I.
notes. I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah,
You should read
it's
it. It's a fantastic piece.
oh, thank you.
Okay, so this ties into that somewhat, not in Children of Men, but I was listening to a podcast recently where, it was Bill Simmons was talking to, I think, Andy Samberg, and he was talking about like kind of celebrities and what would surprise people about them, like who's too. Oh no, maybe it wasn't him. It was actually no, it was an interview with a basketball player where he was talking to him about which basketball players are surprisingly short or surprisingly tall, and I thought that was really funny. But you've interviewed a lot of people in person. What would you say the most surprising thing you discovered about a person that you interviewed or profiled in person, like a
Ah.
characteristic?
The absolute unhurried conversational generosity and quotable honesty of Ian McShane. I was really expecting Ian McShane to like bust my balls, because that's kind of
That's
the
him.
character he plays in everything.
Yeah.
And was expecting him to be like, okay, let's get this over with. I don't like promoting anything. We sat in an Italian restaurant for like, I ran out of questions. I
That's
like didn't have
awesome.
anything else left to ask him, and I kept trying to like do the polite thing where like we ran over the allotted time, so I was like, I don't want to keep you. You can, we can wrap this up. And he just kept saying like, no, love, it's great. Like, let's keep going. I don't have anything to do. I was totally shocked at the fact that, I mean, Ian McShane was very much like his characters in that he was completely no bullshit and like dissed movies that he had been in, and was
Hmm.
just like openly, talking shit about past directors and whatever. But he was in no way like his characters in terms of being a hard ass to have a conversation with.
Yeah,
I was totally shocked by that. Completely unlike what you would expect from him.
that's amazing. All right, last question. Every comic fan has that, I don't want to say guilty pleasure because some people don't really feel guilty about it,
Mm.
but everybody has that book that people would be really surprised to learn that they love. You already mentioned Ultimates. I feel like that might be up there, but I feel like that's generally considered to be great still. What is the
Yeah.
one comic that people would be most surprised to learn that you love?
Oh, wow. That is such an interesting question. What is a comic that I mean, oh, it's another Mark Miller, Nemesis, which is like an unconscionable comic. It's completely like unforgivable morally, but it's so exciting and has so many offensive ideas that just like pierce your brain. Again, it's like reading EC Comics in the 50s, in that like it's stuff that's just completely wrong, but it's you go, what mind came up with this? I mean, there's
Evil
nothing.
Batman runs on Air Force One to abduct the president. It's amazing.
Yes, and right, and rigs somebody's womb with bombs. Like it's completely unacceptable, and it's sort of like how one of my favorite movies to watch is Crank: High Voltage.
Yes.
Like a movie whose morals are completely off and whose politics are just utterly not mine. But there's when you get a really good thrill ride, there's nothing quite like it. So yeah, Nemesis is probably the one that I'm on some level embarrassed to admit how much I enjoy and how often I think about. But also Steve McNiven's pencils are incredible. I mean,
yeah.
That you can remove from morality.
I well, two quick things. Crank High Voltage has maybe the greatest kaiju fight in the history of kaiju movies,
yes,
which is amazing. I actually really love both the Crank movies. I think they're insane and really fun.
Yes,
but the other thing is like, generally speaking, like the big thing for me in terms of the guilty pleasure, it's not even a guilty pleasure. I genuinely love the guy. I am a huge Mark Miller fan, and it's so like a lot of people really have a lot of beef with him. I understand the beef, but at the same time, it's like I appreciate the fact that, you know, people say he storyboards movies, but the fact of the matter is those comics are really entertaining. And
he's extremely good at entertaining people.
I love that. Like, you know, I don't need every book to be Watchmen where I have to read like prose sections about pirates to like get the story. I sometimes I just want like big stupid action, and it works.
Yeah. No, he's an excellent storyteller. I don't think he particularly likes me because of that article that came out, but you know, I'm still out there riding and dying for a lot of the stuff he's done.
Well, and the underrated part about him too is that the artists that work with him love him, so he has the most unbelievable Rolodex for artists to work with.
No, and that's something. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you can critique about Mark Miller, but he is so good to his artists, and there are so many people who are terrible to artists, and he is you know, that's something admirable. And you know, in doing my interviews for that article, I mean, all the artists had only, you know, the nicest things to say about him and seemed to genuinely have a passion for working with him. So yeah, you know, people contain multitudes. There's a lot to say about Mark Miller.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and saying a lot about all kinds of things with me, Abraham. That's all I have for you. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was a great time.
Thank you. This was completely a delight. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with journalist Abraham Riesman. You can find him on Twitter at Abraham Joseph, on his website at abrahamriesman.com, and his work on Vulture and New York Magazine. If you're a fan of the show, there's some big news. Off Panel now has a Patreon. If you like the show and want to support it, consider backing it on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. There are fun rewards and insider information you can get if you do. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Henning Zollers, Adrian Diaz, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, Darren Neely, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Michael Perlman, Bill Knoll, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Schipper, Barry Straw, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Dan Lee, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Christopher Carter, Nicholas Kesslake, Brian Dickerson, Greg Rucka, Ryan Mayle, Adam Highfill, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Johan Borander, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Matt Battaglia, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD. Follow it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. Quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from the album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.